We are live once again with the Emissary Publishing Podcast with my friend and colleague, Paul Edwards. Paul, good to see you, buddy.
Good to see you, Jason. Happy New Year as we're recording this on the second day of January in 2024. And boy, did we pick the right guest for a theme that we have been talking about amongst ourselves. We've had the opportunity to share it with some people, but now we get to share it with the audience. And that is how many people we talk to who say, I want to write a book. And we say, yeah, no, you don't.
Yeah, the amount of effort that is required to produce a book, it should not be underestimated. It is not for the faint of heart to not only go through the prep work and figuring out what message do I want to share, but then put in all the effort required and take away time and resources from something else that you might have been doing to then write your book. But then even after you write your book, doesn't mean anybody cares.
Yeah.
And you got to go and market that book and make people aware of the message that you want to share. Otherwise, what was that? Was that old movie? We won't say the name, but if you build it, they will come. Turns out is not necessarily true. And so we're excited to have Ryan James Miller on with us today. Ryan, welcome to the Emissary Publishing Podcast.
What's up, guys? Happy New Year. It's good to be here.
It's Miller time.
Something like that.
Something like that.
Well, the title of this podcast is Stop Wasting Your Time with Ryan James Miller. I'm intrigued. We talked very briefly before the show about what's on your mind. You've written a book and you exposed some secrets about how difficult that was, why people should maybe pause.
Yeah, I guess I'll just get right into it and let it fly. When I finally committed to writing this book or a book, it was about 3 years ago. And at that time, one of the things that I was absolutely adamant that I would not do was write a book to create another business card for myself. That's what everybody said was, oh, it's a great business card. It's a great promotional tool. And I was like, I don't need another business card, like that seems so pointless to me. And anyway, so through a series of events, I committed to writing a book. The book that I actually started writing, I wrote 5.5 chapters of, stopped, took about a month pause, and then set out to write this book, which I did. And I just, as I reflect back, and, even as we were talking offline right before, one of the things that comes to mind for me is we only have, it's so cliche, but we only have so much time in our life, and that's personally, professionally, everything. And so why would you ever waste so much time writing something that you didn't absolutely love, were fully invested into, completely cared about, and were willing to go literally to hell and back for? And I just feel like if you can't say yes, and I know this is just me and not everybody is like me, but if you can't say yes to all of those things, I feel like you should never do it. Yeah. There are so many better ways to spend your time, your money, to ways to market your business than to write a book if you're not going to be fully in it, because it is just brutal.
Yeah.
So how about that? You're speaking our language, really, because I think some people really should assess why they want to have a book out there in the first place. If you have a message to share, it doesn't mean you need a book to do it. There
Yep.
might be better ways to invest your time and effort. However, on the flip side of it, I've found that people who've written books have a certain concentration to their concepts that people who've not written books are missing. They have
Mm,
they have really gone through the hard work of distilling down what they want to say, what is
mm.
really valuable, and that concentration of wisdom, I think, surpasses folks who've not gone through the effort of writing a book.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you know, so I briefly mentioned that I wrote 5.5 chapters of a book, closed that chapter and rewrote. And that book was my coaching philosophy. So it
Mm.
was what, you know, a lot of people call a knowledge share. It's like, hey, I'm going to give you the 7 steps to, you know, living the dream life, whatever it was. And the reason I stopped was I was really just praying through as I was writing the book and trying to just, as best as I could, hear from the Lord, like, what am I supposed to be doing here? And what's the purpose? And I got to this place of thinking to myself, like, this is so stupid.
Mm,
Everybody has access to this information. And as a matter of fact, if people don't buy into me, if they don't get connected to me and attached to me, then they're not going to care about anything else I say. I'm not, you know, a Brendan Burchard or a Oprah or somebody that's so recognizable. So it's like, I really have to give them a reason. And so as I started thinking about that reason, the reason always came back to my story. And I've lived a fairly interesting life. And most people are like, yeah, whatever. But I'm like, really, in 45 and change years, a lot's happened to me. I've been through a lot. And I thought, that's the story I need to tell, is my story.
mm,
And so, Jason, to your point, which was really interesting, was as I started writing, the reason really started to develop. And it wasn't even as much telling my story, because again, like, I'm just some random guy from Southern California. Nobody really cares to hear my story. But I started, the more I wrote, the more I realized that I was giving other people permission, particularly men, though that's not necessarily the intended audience, but giving people permission to be vulnerable in the
Mm.
things that hurt the most, and yet that give us the greatest opportunity for growth and gain.
mm.
And so that it's interesting that you said that, because I haven't really articulated it like that before, but it was like, as I was writing, the purpose became more clear. And even now, post publish and marketing it, it's becoming more and more and more clear. But it's really hard to figure that out oftentimes until you get started in the process.
Mm. So you're coming now. We've encountered a few instances like this, right? Where what's the you know, whatever expertise and knowledge transfer you bring to an audience needs to be brought at them from a different angle than they might be expecting it, right? They're expecting it in the templated Brendan Burchard formula, Tony Robbins, whatever, right? Here's the 6 steps you need to do this. And now you're coming at them from an angle, no, this is who I am. And I also happen to do this, right? And they'll pick up on that through the story. And I think that that's really, in print especially, that's the way you have to, in the noise of the marketplace today, where especially if you're in an industry or a profession where lots of other people do what you do, how else are you going to stand out except through your personal story? And moreover, you've come at it from the angle of vulnerability, which is one of the things I've always admired the most about you in all the years that we've known each other, which uh, which has a way, I think, of connecting with the person that you would really want to work with anyway, because people don't have. It's one of my favorite sayings. I borrowed this from an old friend of mine. People don't have business problems; they have personal problems they bring into their business. And if they don't have anywhere they can be honest about it, then they run into the, you know, up the creek without a paddle scenarios that are so common to
Yep.
people who do well and achieve in business. And so I think you're coming at it from the kind of angle that we would encourage one of our authors to do. And in fact, that Jason, we've done that with a couple of people that we've spoken to.
Well, and to your point, something that I think is really important in the midst of that you said, again, I think this is where, keeping on even theme with this specific episode, I think that we can completely waste our effort and energy by trying to put a new spin on something old because we want to stand out. And so it's, you guys know this, and Paul, I know you specifically have been doing this for a long time, but like, this idea of branding is so dangerous because on one hand, we all kind of sound and look like everybody else, right? I mean, we get into a lane, we get into a niche, and we kind of all sound the same. And yet, Steve Martin, the comedian, once was quoted as saying, "Be so good you can't be ignored." And I try to think to myself, like, even as I was writing, like, what's different? What's really going to make me stand out?
Yeah.
And for me, it went back to, and maybe not everybody in your audience is going to relate to or agree with this, and that's totally okay. But I believe that every single one of us has been uniquely created by God and wired in such a way that even though in many ways we share similar themes, ideas, beliefs, whatever, there is something unique about every single one of us. And so I think that that is the important thing to bring into whatever story you're trying to tell, whatever book you're trying to write, whatever concept you're trying to share. It's like, we all would read Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People and say, okay, all 7 of those habits can apply to my life, my business, whatever. But if I was to write that, I would write that differently than he did. Not as good for sure, but I would write that differently because I have different life experience and because I'm wired differently and I have different passions and I have different purpose. And so I think that's what's important, which requires, this is a plug for you guys, though, whatever. It's just like, you have to go to a professional that can help to extract that, because I think too often we're too blind to truly understand our unique value proposition in the midst of that story we're trying to tell. And as a result, we end up just trying to put a different spin on something old. And again, it just becomes a total waste of time because all it is just another version of something that's been written 700 times before.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that stands out for me from what we're talking about here is music is highly subjective. Right now, if I want to listen to music to relax, there's a certain type of music I listen to relax to. Right, it tends to be soft. If I'm looking to zone out, I might listen to something without words because my mind gets all confused by the words, and now I'm off thinking of this stuff instead of thinking about the thing I'm supposed to work on. If I really want to work on, get to work on something, program something, write something, I'll listen to some techno, probably just like something with a beat, no words. If I want to jam out in my house, I might listen to some hip hop. Now, if I were to take that experience into my parents' house, for instance, and throw on some hip hop because, we're making some food, my dad would probably throw me out, because we each have our own subjective things that we engage in, right? Things that we like, and it's neither good nor bad. And so when we take, like you talk about, these old principles and bring them into our personal experience, there is a connection that I have to perhaps old principles, which is going to be uniquely different, like we're talking about, from somebody else's connection, as uniquely different as our likes in music. I might hate your like in music, and I might hate the way you say, some given principle. I might completely disagree with your lived experience of that principle, even though it's your lived experience, and you might completely disagree with mine. And we come to these, I think, old principles, and this is the second thing I want to talk about. We come to these old principles, which are they are in one sense objectively true and then subjectively lived out. One of those is the early bird gets the worm. We might all agree to that, right? We might also agree with good things come to those who wait. Both of those are true, but subjectively lived out. You cannot always be the early bird. Sometimes early bird. Sometimes that's a terrible idea. You're not always going to get good things just because you wait. So this idea of subjectivity, even old principles feel brand new sometimes, and we engage with these old principles based on somebody's unique viewpoint, unique delivery, unique working out of those principles. And so I think, Ryan, one of the things I see in your work is that you might have these old principles, but you live them out in a unique way. And someone is going to uniquely attach to your voice and hear you when they will not hear somebody else and their unique delivery of it or their unique life experience of it.
Yeah, no, I think that's super duper good. And one thing I try to be really careful of myself is we live in a society today where we're always looking for the newest, latest, greatest thing. And there are definitely some new technologies and ideas out there that are super helpful to us. But I've really tried to go back to the quote unquote basics of things. And so, again, I think it's so important that while I'm trying to put my spin or tell my story, that I'm not avoiding the simplicity of what I'm trying to communicate. I'm not trying to avoid the basic principle or the old school style. Again, like I referenced Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Most people don't even know who Stephen Covey is or what that book is. If you were to ask them, like, what is the most popular book on habits? Most people would say Atomic Habits by James Clear. And I'd say that's a fantastic book. I really love that book. I love the way James Clear writes. And yet, if you read it, you're going to read most of Covey's principles restated in Clear's voice. And so it's like, we don't always have to go to the new thing. And so again, like as I was writing, that was one thing that my team was super helpful with me on, was just wrangling me back in. Like, just tell the story. Don't overdo the analogy. Don't overtell share the concept. Just communicate.
Yeah.
And what I was really proud of, and not everybody can do this, and that's totally fine, but like I wrote it myself, and I'm not a great writer. At least I don't think so, but I used my voice. It was the way I communicate. It was it was my experience. And so I didn't want anybody else to be writing my experience for me. And so again, it reminded me back to this idea of like, I just have to just tell it the way that it is. And there's going to be things that people are like, oh, I've read that before. Oh, I know that before. Like one of the most challenging feedback I got from the book was, I had a client, she reached out to me afterwards and she goes, oh my gosh, she goes, I can't believe it. She says, I read your book in one night. And I was like, gosh, what a waste. Like, I spent all this time, effort, and energy, and this person spent their hard-earned money and their time, and they got through this whole thing in a couple of hours. Like, there must not been a lot of value in that. And it must not have been as powerful as I had hoped it would be, that somebody could just get through it that fast. And then I thought to myself, wait a minute, that's not the point. Like, my point was to tell my story, and hopefully it made an impact. And come to find out later on, we would have a conversation, and she talked about all the ways that it impacted her and all the things that it did. So again, it was like, I don't need to overdo this. I don't need to make it bigger than it is. I just need to be and to do as I'm called to. And through that, the right impact is going to happen.
Our newest author this year, we're working through finishing up his manuscript right now. And his unique story is having served in every major U.S. conflict from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Not many people can say that. And what's become so fun about this, as the editor, right, as the person looking over this, and he's doing the writing, it's in his voice, but he's able to take examples that you can look at in history that for most of, at least for our generation, is still pretty fresh, right? That's not many years before all of us were born, and stuff we grew up hearing about and learning about. He's able to point to these macro scale versions of the same journey that he went through as just a private in the Army, or a sailor in the Navy, and tie them together using these, those core principles that you ran up against. And so what
Mm.
we encouraged him towards that. He said, yeah, you got to know what are the things that you've run up against in life. You've either instinctively cooperated with them and they've worked, or you've banged your head against the wall enough times that you gave up and surrendered to it. And there's just a million different ways to spin that, but the context is what makes it so interesting to read about, because you hear him in the one moment he's describing mistakes made by the president of the United States, and then the next minute he's saying, and I made the same mistake, and let me tell you how. So it's wonderful when you start to when it becomes clear to you what really sticks out and matters and can be taken from one person like a flame on a candle to the next, and they can still use it, and you draw them towards that principle with your authentic story, the background that only you could have lived through, and no one else can tell quite the way you do, with the detail and the perspective that you held about it at the time, maybe, versus how you, especially if you think about it differently now.
Yeah. Well, and I think to something you said, it just makes it makes me, or reminds me that that's why working with the right people to do this is also so important. Again, like, I think sometimes people enter into this and they think to themselves, like, I'm going to do this as cheaply as possible because I need to get it out there. And again, I think that just goes back to the theme, like, what a waste. You don't have to go out and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, clearly, but I think it requires I know that it requires the right team to help guide the author in the right direction, because you guys bring a level of experience around how it reads, how it's received, what the structure looks like. And again, these are things that 99.9% of the population don't think about. I mean, I have been publicly, professionally speaking now for 20 years. I've spoken well over 1,000 different times. And so communication is not a problem for me, but the structure of writing is, and formatting a story in such a way that it will be succinct across an entire book from chapter to chapter. And I think, again, those are the things that most people don't consider, how you transition from the end of one chapter into the next one, especially when you're storytelling, which obviously, almost every book is. And so those, again, were things to me that I thought about, but I didn't really think about. And I was so fortunate to have a team of people that were helping guide me, because I remember I wrote my first draft and they called it a vomit draft. And it was just, 52,000 words or something like that. That was just like blah.
Right.
And then I got my first bit of feedback and it was like, okay, so how is this going to be structured? And, you're going to tell your story, because the way my book is laid out is I tell the story. There's kind of 9 pivotal moments in my life. I tell the story of that season of my life. And through some of that, I'm kind of sharing, the learning lesson as it was happening. But at the end of every chapter is a reflection back onto what happened, why that happened, and how I learned and grew from it. But I didn't think of that. They did. I was just going to tell the story and kind of conclude with, so you get it? And,
right. Yeah.
And the feedback I got was, no, you need to give them a wrap on your story, but you also need to give them something to chew on apart from just reading a good story. And, some of, like, probably one of my favorite present day memoirs that's been written was Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins. And the way that he wrote that book and told the story and provided anecdote and lesson and analogy all throughout was so phenomenal. But then he would also finish with such a practical landing place at the end of each chapter that transitioned into the next. And so again, I think these things are so important and they're often overlooked. And I'm afraid that in a day of AI and ease of access to information and technology, that those things are going to be missed. And so we already see so much garbage out on the internet in terms of just content and garbage of books. I mean, just the number of books written every single year is absurd to me. But I think it's only going to get worse because people are trying to cut corners to get their quote unquote business card out there. And they're going to, again, just waste. I mean, even if they only spent $500, which I don't even know if you could do that, but what a waste of money and what a waste of time. And then what a waste of promotion. And just, I don't know, just, it just seems like it's going to get worse.
Well, the tagline for Emissary Publishing is "We tell the stories that matter." And the other side of that coin is that not every story matters, and we're not afraid to parse that out. Because to your point, there's a lot of people want to say a lot of things, and whether they should be said or not is up for I guess some subjectivity. But I want to go back to a statement you made very briefly. You just like threw it into a sentence there that circles back around with the title is to "Stop Wasting Your Time." You said something about you're called to, and I think that in these messages that matter for folks who desperately want to say something, how did you know that you weren't wasting your time with this book? How did you know that you were quote unquote called to? What were the criteria that you said, I really do need to share this? This is a story worth telling?
Oof. Man, let me try and narrow that down a little bit because it could get lengthy. But a few people may know, Paul does know, but so kind of like the catalytic event for me was my wife and I and 5 of our friends were in the crowd in Las Vegas when the mass shooting happened back in 2017. One of our friends was one of the 58 killed that night. And so on the back end of that, I was a pastor of a church at the time. I was coaching and speaking. And so I was out there in the public a lot, and I was getting asked over and over again, like, more about what happened and the story. And then people started saying, "Hey, you need to write a book." And I said, absolutely not. I said, I am not going to write a book that profits off the back of my friend that was killed, the other 57 people that were killed, the 1,000 people that were injured, or the 22,000 people that will have their lives wrecked forever in one way or another. I'm not going to do it. And it took 3 years for me to even entertain the idea of beginning to tell that story. And so that was, I guess, confirmation number one, was I fought against it for so long before I was even willing to give it a chance. Secondly, so again, like this loses a few people, but if God creates me personally, Ryan Miller, if God creates me with intention and purpose to go out and live a life that he calls me to impact specific people, to serve my wife and my whatever, if he does that, then that means that every single moment of my life has worth and value. There's meaning. And for me specifically, as I started to consider the most valuable moments in my life, they were all these wounds, these tragic events, either things that I did, my own gambling, near infidelity on my wife, or wounds that were done to me, things like my parents' divorce, Route 91, just so many other things. And so I thought to myself, I've got to make good on all these awful moments. Like there's no way that God was wasting moments of my life. Like they hurt, they sucked. Some of them I'm still not completely healed from. And so if there's purpose and intention and I don't want to waste any moment, then I need to do something with it. And so that was part of that stop writing the knowledge share book and shift to the memoir, was I need to tell this story again, not because I don't matter. I don't. I'm one of, a billion people in this world or whatever, but there's something in the story that's going to matter to somebody else that's worth sharing this with. And so that's what led me into it. But I want to say this too. Still now, I mean, I published in September, so we're 4 months removed from that. I still question all the time whether I did it right or not. Like, you know, we sold a decent number of books, a couple hundred books day one. And, you know, I think we've sold about 700 to this point, which is good for us. You know, again, nobody, no name. And I booked some speaking gigs off of it, which has been super cool. And I've got some great feedback. But there's still these moments that I just keep thinking to myself, like, was it really worth it? I mean, in total, most people don't know this, but my publisher went bankrupt 6 weeks before I was set to publish. They took me for $30,000. So all in, this book cost me about $50,000 just to get across the finish line. And now marketing since then, it's cost me well over 10,000 more. So like I'm into this book way, way more. And it cost me so much distraction in my business and so many other things. And so again, like it was just all these questions. But again, to answer your question, the call is confirmed when I get a message a week ago from some stranger, literal stranger, that says that they were on the verge of divorce, and reading my story allowed him to be vulnerable enough to go to his wife and admit that he has not been the husband that she deserves. And he's going to do whatever it takes to reinvigorate the 14-year marriage that they had, so he does not lose his wife and his kids. And so I don't think we always get that call and that confirmation from the moment that we decide to write. I didn't. Like I felt like it, like I was going in the right direction, but I think it's that constant affirmation over long periods of time, which again goes back to you better really mean what you're about to say. You better have really good purpose and intention for the story that you want to write, because you're going to battle for days, weeks, months, years, whatever, around whether or not you made the right decision. And you may not ever monetarily get back what you invested into it. You may never get the hundreds or thousands of hours, but for every bit of feedback that I get from somebody that says like, I turned away from my addictions because I read that you did at one point in your life, or like this gets me really emotional, or the marriage story. Like I nearly slept with another woman and threw away my marriage 4 years into my own marriage. And so to read that somebody made a similar decision just because of reading my stupid story, like it's so insignificant, and yet it means the world to me. And so that to me is just the grace of God in reminding me moment by moment, hopefully for the rest of my life, that everything that I gave over and all the sacrifices that I made to not just the experience, but actually writing, that it was worth it.
One of the sayings that I really love is, when's the best time to plant a tree? The answer is 20 years ago. And I look at sometimes the things that we invest in, perhaps like writing a book, a story that we think needs to be told. We plant that tree, we give that message to the world, and then we don't know where it goes necessarily from there. We do it with the intent, I think, of using that message, of believing that message is somehow going to grow into, much like a tree, is going to grow into giving us shade in our yard years from now. But if we don't plant it, it's guaranteed to not grow. It's guaranteed to go nowhere. And so I look at sometimes these things that matter to us. We have to believe at some point that there is something bigger that will grow out of this. And much like you, look at our insignificant, sometimes laughable, sometimes, horrifically unwise decisions, and trust that these are going to be used years from now. As we tell them, it's going to be used to give somebody else shade. It's going to be used to better it. Now, we don't know. After we give it to the world, we don't know what happens with it. Maybe that whole tree gets plowed down. Maybe it dies. Maybe it, maybe it does continue to grow and somebody else enjoys it for years to come. But if we don't plant that tree, nothing's going to happen from it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, you may not have thought about this for a while, Rye, but of course you were instrumental in doing for me what you did for those people who read your book, right? That mastermind we were at in LA a couple of years ago, and you drew to my attention that I had failed to be the kind of husband that I really could be. And then I went home and put my hand to the plow, and before you could look around, I was having the happiest season of all time, which goes on to this day in my marriage. All I see here is two different versions of the same story. One occurred in person, the other one occurred in print. Which is to say, right, you still wonder if it was the right thing to do. I'm reminded of another saying from a fictional character, but from the same region as the one Jason quoted, and that's Mr. Miyagi saying, "If it comes from inside, always the right one." Right? It's always the right thing if it comes from inside, and it does. It comes from a very deep, profound place in your soul. Now, there's of course the tendency of the market to misunderstand what you're up to place their own measuring stick on that. Say, well, it didn't sell as many copies as the Harry Potter series. I know that. I understand that, but that's really not a useful measuring stick for what we're talking about here. Because we're talking, again, you're on the same sheet of music as we are. We're talking about the stories that matter. And fiction can do a great job of dramatizing stories that matter, but real life is the story.
Yeah.
This wasn't just a figment of some person's imagination. It really happened. And if there's something that can be gleaned from that and passed on, like the flame on the candle, it can't possibly be wrong.
Yeah.
You could possibly have made the wrong choice.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other helpful gifts I was given when I started to write early on, and again, I think this is so important, is I was asked what my goal was in writing the book. And it was so helpful because, again, on one hand, like, I want to sell 1 million copies. God only knows how that would happen, but like, I would love to do that. And I would love to be, featured on every talk show talking about what happened and whatever. Like, I want it all. I want all of that stuff. That's just fits into my whole dream of a platform and presence and, impact and whatever. But that's not real. At least that's not realistic. That we can still dream about that stuff, but that's not realistic. And so what they really helped me do was I was helped to pare it down to a couple of key things. And one of those was how do you want this to help impact your business? And so I was able to articulate that. One was how do you want this to help you grow as an individual? I was able to articulate that. And then probably the coolest one was they asked us, I was asked, what is the champagne moment? And I was like, what? And they said, what is the moment after you published your book in which you would break out the champagne for? And so immediately, right, you go to those like big high markers and they're like, nope, we want to take all those away. You get one moment. What is one thing that will happen to you as the result of writing this book that you will say, I did it? And I am not joking. My champagne moment was fulfilled when I got that message from that random stranger about his marriage. It was literally almost verbatim, as if God heard every word that I spoke and was just waiting for the moment through all the hardship, through all the frustration, through the loss, through the anger, through the dark moments of I'm quitting and I'm not even going to finish this. And he was like, now here you go. Break out the champagne.
Yeah.
And I cannot encourage people enough. Like, dream big, like reach for the most amazing heights possible with whatever you're going to write for yourself. But at the end of the day, think about that moment that will really confirm in your heart that I did it. And whatever you call that, that to me is so critical, because it's one of those tools that allows us to not get caught up in the, I've got to do this for somebody else. I've got to make this really big. I've got to match these people. Again, I still want all those things, but what I really want is what matters most. And so something like that was just so helpful.
Yeah.
Wow. That's good. It's a good way to wrap it up.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, right, even if you were to get all those things, if now you have to put on a big dog and pony show to keep it going, how exhausting would that be? How demoralizing would it be to reach the top and realize that the only reason you got there was by playing the dog and pony show and doing the dance and all that, and the world isn't really interested in the real you, they're interested in the fake you.
Yep. Can't keep that up for very long.
Yeah. I'd rather be in poverty.
Yeah.
So the book is called Wounds. Rye, where do we send people? What's the quickest route to pick up a copy?
Woundsbook.com, WOUNDSBOOK.com. You can go there. You can grab a copy of the book. Check out some of the other stuff that we're doing as the result of that. That's the best place to go.
And if you're thinking about a compelling presenter or speaker at your event, as a personal witness of Ryan's dynamism on stage, I heartily encourage you to consider hiring him to speak at your next event. Ryan, maybe we'll have you out whenever we do one of our workshops in LA, and would love to see you again soon when you're out in the desert. And that's about all we got for this week. My name is Paul Edwards. My co-host is Jason Todd. We are Emissary Publishing, telling the stories that matter for faith-based founders and executives. We will see you on the next episode.